Dave, I guess before we start, tell everyone about yourself. What's your journey to this point?
You know, I grew up as a giant computer nerd, actually. So I fell in love with an old Apple II that my uncle had, and so I kind of set off my career when I was 7 or 8. But I was also just a huge math and science nerd, so I did an undergrad in math, I did a PhD in physics, I later picked up a master's in biotech from working in the industry. But when I finished my PhD, I realized I'm a pretty lousy academic. I'm just too impatient and want to get things done. So I went into consulting, did that for a number of years. And then about a decade ago, I landed at Moderna. I was a team of one to start at a company of 150 people. Fast forward 10 years later, it was a 5,500 person company. I was chief data and AI officer with about a 200 person organization. So it was a crazy, wild ride. But I did leave about 6 months ago. I realized it's just time to move on. Amazing journey there, but time to have more impact elsewhere.
Excellent. Yeah. So obviously Moderna, we all think of it as the sort of the COVID vaccine company. That's where you guys sort of became a common name in the industry or in the world. Obviously, that's not where you all started, though. So I guess if you could just share some of the journey of, you said you joined when there was about 150 people, or 5 people got a lot bigger. Talk about the journey of how Moderna evolved and how that actually helped you embrace data science, AI, and being willing to experiment.
Yeah, I mean, the vision of the company was that, messenger RNA is this programmable molecule, right? And so you can code into it whatever instructions you want for whatever protein of interest. And so it could be this platform to produce a wide variety of different medicines. And so early on, it was either very binary of this is not going to work at all, and mRNA is not going to be a medicine, or it's going to be a platform of dozens of medicines. Mm-hmm. And so very early on, we realized, look, we have to invest in technology, not just because of the informational nature of this, but for us as a company to really realize the potential of the technology, we have to build for success. We have to build to go big. And so we made large investments in technology, including algorithms to support systems and processes across the entire R&D spectrum to be able to realize that potential of the medicines.
No, excellent. Yeah, and I think obviously a lot of focus early on in the discovery, the bioinformatics stage. I guess, how does your AI-driven process, your data science-driven process, how does that differ from where a lot of other organizations are doing it in the more traditional way?
Well, if you think of how machine learning works in contrast to traditional research, right? And traditional research is very hypothesis-driven. It's about understanding the mechanisms of disease, the pathways for that, coming up with hypotheses for targets to approach, to really understand, what is the right way to target this, to bring a medicine to market. Machine learning doesn't care about any of that. Right? It just fundamentally doesn't care about the mechanism. It's a pattern recognition algorithm at its core. A bunch of inputs predicting some outputs, right? Now, being a little bit facetious here, obviously, I think it's critically important for a data science team to deeply understand the science of what's going on and to build that information, that knowledge into those models. But it is still fundamentally a pattern recognition problem. And this can be really unsettling for scientists. One of my favorite examples of this is back in 2018, DeepMind did a paper where they were looking at retinal image scans. I don't know if you've seen this study, but these are, when you go to your optometrist and they take a picture of your eye and there's the orange blob with veins in it, right? They just took these and they said, what can we do with these? And they found out that with almost 90% accuracy, they can predict whether that retinal image came from a male or a female, right? Completely, a complete surprise. They had no idea, just looking at that picture, the model can do it. It's able to find subtle patterns in the kind of vascular imagery there that betrays what the sex of the patient was of that, right? Without any kind of mechanistic understanding of what's going on. And I had this same kind of effect internally at Moderna. I remember sitting once with a scientist and showing him the outputs of a model, and he just looked at me dumbfounded and said, but how does the model know, right? How does it know? And it's really unsettling. And trained as a physicist, this was hard for me, right? I grew up with first principles. Everything is comes from common foundational rules. So it took me a long time to just get comfortable with the unknown here, and to realize that look, even if you don't understand everything that's going on in this model, how it comes up with its predictions, it still can be incredibly valuable. And for us working in this industry of drug development, that value is bringing medicines to patients faster, right, and better medicines for them. So it's worth kind of getting over to that other edge of comfort there. But then I think it also points the way to interesting new science, right? Just like in this retinal imaging, people didn't know that there was even a difference here, and now they do. And so there's new science that we can trot there. There's ways for us to unstick ourselves think about it too with the large language models, about how it's recasting how we think about language and really moving that field forward and how these models are interpreting what language is.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about how you were even surprised and shocked by some of the discoveries, some of the things you learned during the process. I guess just curious, you obviously came from a technology, hey, we're exploring perspective. I think the exploration part, the trying to test hypothesis part is very core to scientific research. So how did the scientists, how did the folks actually doing the work, how did they react? Was it as jarring for them as it was for you, or how did you guide them sort of through that journey into acceptance of, hey, there's potentially different ways to do it a little bit?
Well, one of my former Moderna colleagues is in the crowd here, and he can tell you that one of the key features of Moderna is that there's just way too much work, right? Everyone's working really hard, doing too much stuff. So to a great degree, that helped get people over that, is if you're able to take things away from them, help them focus on the core parts of their job, they think they're really happy with that. But it's just time, it's just comfort to get to the point for people to accept that this is what it is. But I do think it's a balance, right? If you say none of that matters, the science doesn't matter, we don't care about hypotheses, right, and just focus on outputs, I don't think that's the right approach either. Because realistically, these models aren't magical wands, like Nick said earlier, that can solve everything. It's a combination of these two things working in tandem.
Excellent, yeah. I guess going back a little bit to COVID itself, obviously, like I said, you guys are known for that, helping us get out of that trough. How do you take advantage of technology to sort of accelerate the whole process, bringing it to market?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think everyone kind of remembers the speed at which this happened. It was, from the time that the Chinese authorities released the sequence of the novel coronavirus, it was only 42 days later that Moderna had shipped a GMP-grade batch of material to clinical trials for testing, and the study started like 20 days later. Right? This is normally a process that takes years to do that. So I'd love to say that it was, again, a magic wand that then pressed a button and AI magically designed all of this. The reality is it's much more complicated than that, right? This was a ton of work from hundreds of people who really, killed themselves hard to make this happen. But it was also built on the backs of 10 years of work and innovation and the mRNA science, but also in the digital platforms that I referenced earlier, infused with all these algorithms. And there were quite a few of them involved in that journey, from how we did back translation, how we did DNA template design, to how we quality controlled material. And so it was a real validation of our thesis there that, as I said earlier, we believe we need to put these technological systems in place for the future. And it just showed that that was correct, right? That technology, when it's applied in the right way to these scientific processes, can have a really transformative effect.
Yeah, and I guess was that universally accepted? Was it a top-down mandate that says, hey, we embrace technology, we know it can make a difference? Or was it more of a bottoms-up approach? Because we see both different types of engagements in organizations.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges in this industry is that technology is often viewed as a cost center, not a strategic partner. And I know some of you have lived that, where you kind of just told what to do, stretch budgets and so on. We were very fortunate early on to have buy-in at the most senior levels. So Stefan Bonsell was always very committed to the digital vision there. And so that certainly helped a lot. But it is working at all those different levels, working at the senior levels and working at the ground troop folks.
Excellent. You talked a little bit, obviously, about the technology part. Nick talked about it, Sol talked about it, but there's different components of bringing AI and data science. You need the data, you need the technology, you need the process. I guess from your perspective, obviously it seems like the culture was embracing of it. What was your biggest challenge, in particular for a discovery perspective, to actually use AI data science in that process?
I think it's starting to say the culture embraced it. I think we had some strong tailwinds because of senior leadership. But like I said, in general, this industry doesn't embrace technology that way. But if you can get through that barrier, I think one of the big challenges we ran into is that the users don't really understand what AI is and how it's used. They understand apps, right? People grew up in a world of computers, computer applications, so people will come to us and say, I've got a problem, can you give me an app for this? Right? They have a good intuition of when a piece of software can solve a problem. They have no intuition for an AI problem. So we'll get people come out of left field and say something like, I want an AI that can create a custom tailored training program for someone's unique background and search the internet for all of it. And I was like, that sounds awesome, right? If you could do that, you can go build a company. But those are really difficult problems to solve. And so what we ended up doing on the cultural front was upskilling the organization. So we built what we called an AI academy, and we've talked about that very publicly. And the idea about this was just to prepare the company for this state where AI is just going to be everywhere in the same way that digital technology is today. And so it's multi-tiered. We targeted the broad group of folks in the company with programs around, it's more asynchronous, kind of small group setting discussions for them to upskill and learn. Then we targeted managers differently, and then we targeted senior leaders to a different way. Senior leaders is probably one of the most frustrating and difficult cohorts to work with, if any of you have had to deal with that. They don't have a lot of time. They don't have a lot of patience. They don't spend a lot of time learning new things, unfortunately. And they tend to be older and less tech savvy for this. So I think we did a really amazing job on the kind of broad company training, and I think that bears out with ChatGPT arrived, how quickly the company embraced that. But it was definitely a struggle at the senior levels, even with the buy-in of the CEO.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
But that's on the culture side. I mean, you asked about the question of what are the other struggles. I think the bigger one is probably on the data side. As Nick said earlier, the technology part's not actually the hard part. Like the modeling part, the infrastructure part, those are solvable problems. But if you don't have the data, it's pointless, right? And in this industry, what's really frustrating and challenging about biology is it exists in the real world, right? And so that getting data about the real world turns out to be really time consuming and really expensive. Clinical trials cost hundreds of millions of dollars for summary data that can fit in a spreadsheet, right? It's a completely different profile from what you see in the kind of broad consumer tech world. And so often you just don't have the data that you need, especially not the data that's commensurate with the complexity of the biological systems you're trying to interrogate. So you end up having to focus your scope. And so you look at something like AlphaFold's a great example. It's focused on a really narrow scope of how do you predict the three-dimensional conformation of an amino acid sequence? And it's baked on the back of massive multiple sequence alignments and hundreds of thousands of known crystal structures. And it's able to do that. And it's an amazing technical accomplishment, really kudos to the team. But it's a finite problem with well-defined, good set of clean, high-quality data. Most of the data you find in a typical drug discovery process is really heterogeneous, really messy, really insufficient in scale and consistency to be used in any kind of meaningful machine learning way. So you end up having to then, if you really want to do it, have to generate a lot of that data yourself, right? And so if you look at a lot of the crop of these AI-driven drug discovery companies now, they're building large data sets. They're building large, high-throughput experimentations to interrogate that space to be able to do it.
Excellent. Yeah, no. It's interesting to see, like you said, about AlphaFold and different consortiums. I'll be interested to see long-term if that sort of becomes table stakes and, hey, that information about biology is just widely known across the industry because it doesn't actually change from company to company. I think
there's parts of it that certainly could. I mean, the industry's always been very good about sharing public databases, but there is this fundamental throughput limitation when it comes to in vivo data, right? It takes a lot of money to put stuff into a mouse and test it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess one of the things we talked about previously, and actually Sol talked about before, was how do you transition from proof of concepts to production grade things? And I guess from you said you educated people kept coming and saying, hey, I want this widget, I want this app, et cetera. How did you prioritize both where you wanted to invest your effort, but then how did you educate the teams, your partners, to progress it through that sort of that life cycle to become a production grade application or model?
I mean, in general, I don't believe in proof of concepts. I think they're really only good for one thing, which is making yourself feel good about it. You get a nice little ROC curve and a nice AUC on this like manually curated data set, and you feel good about yourself. But you've delivered zero value to the business until it's in production, integrated in real human workflows. So I joke that the other real use of POCs is to get you budget to do that, right? So I'm actually a bigger fan of more MVPs, minimum viable models, where you're actually already thinking about what this could look like. How would the users interface with this thing? And you're bringing some minimal model to market, to your internal market as your startup, and like shipping the thing, right? Because it's only then when you realize all the things that you didn't think about, right? If you've never deployed a model to production before, you're gonna have all these infrastructure challenges. You have to think about how you're gonna interface it. How are you gonna monitor this thing? How are you going to get the company and your users to adopt this, right? There's a huge amount of stuff that comes spilling out there the first time you actually try to get something done. And so I would encourage you to find something that's tractable and do that early on so that you can de-risk all of these things. Because the first one's going to be painful, the second one's a lot easier. In terms of prioritizing these things, like a lot of it depends on your business partners and whether they'll pony up the budget for that and be the sponsors and resource for it. And every company's different in their mechanisms for this. But if they're not willing to put their hat in the ring and vouch for this thing, then how valuable really is it? In general, we always thought about the world divided into two different types of solutions. There's more the scientific-based ones and then more operational ones. So the scientific ones are the ones about the scientific, the biology itself, right? These tend to be like really cool, really sexy problems. That's why there's startup companies doing that. And they're worth potentially billions of dollars, right? If you manage to use AI to design a drug, you've just created billions of dollars of value. But the probability of success is extremely low, right? They're really hard problems. And if you're interested in taking on one of those problems, you have to just recognize the size of the companies that are doing this, right? If you say, I want to do a protein engineering algorithm, and you've got a 2-person data science team. Well, there are companies of 200-300 people working on that problem. So unless you have some unique take on it, some unique set of data, there's something unique about your company's technology, just be aware that that's what your competition is. So you might want to shy away from those. The more operational ones, these are the human processes that we put in place ourselves as part of running a company and bringing something through to market. Those tend to be far more tractable because they're kind of known, right? You know the inputs, you know the outputs. You may actually have a fair amount of data for these things. You're thinking about regulatory interactions, think about scheduling, logistics, think about patient recruitment, so on. Like these are human processes. And so you actually have a greater chance of solving those. Now, they don't sound as sexy, right? It's more shovel digging than magic wand here. But if you make sure you focus on ones that have a high ROI, I'm talking like a 10x, then kind of the risk-adjusted NPV of these programs tends to be way better than some of these more wild scientific ones. And as you accumulate more and more of these, they have this accretive effect that it spins the flywheel of research much, much faster. So, and we demonstrated that by investing in R&D, as we said, and that's why we're able to get to COVID so quickly.
No, that's interesting. And you brought up the point of, obviously, there's specialized niche organizations doing a lot of really cool data science stuff in particular areas where it might make sense to partner. So I guess, were those discussions you had internally of, hey, what do we tackle internally because we know our science, we know our platform really well, versus where do we potentially partner with other organizations, other companies, other data sources, et cetera?
Yeah, on the modeling side, on the AI side, it was very much a discussion of why are we special? And so there were definitely projects that I would just not greenlight because I didn't see why we were special for this. A good example that came up time and time again was like literature search, right? Everyone's always, how do I monitor the literature for my particular target, my particular therapy? And the fact that no one had already solved what's really a very generic problem that we don't have any kind of special insight into means it's probably a really hard problem. So we should probably stray away from that. But there were things like RNA optimization, right? That is very unique to the way Moderna did, and it's very unique to Moderna's platform. And so those were kinds of problems we looked at. Another type of partnership that happens is very much on the data side of this in pharma, especially as you move into later phase, clinical studies. Pharma outsources a tremendous amount of that work. And so as you think about the data you might need for a problem, you may not have it, right? Your CRO partners have it. We were looking at things like monitoring site performance and trying to predict, what are good sites, for example. And so we talked to a, top one CRO, I won't name, and said, hey, how can we get access to the data from your CTMS? Right? This is just a perfect example of how difficult this is. And it turned out that there's this whole massive project would have had to be undertaken. They're telling us like, oh, well, we'd have to spin up a separate database. We'd have to shuttle data there. We'd have to have an Informatica pipeline that would ship you, whatever you specify in the exact data formats you specify on a weekly basis in a spreadsheet. And my reaction is, it's 2020. I just wanted a real-time API. Like, how hard is that to happen? And it's just, the CROs are not built for this, right? They're not data-centric, tech-centric companies. They're essentially large consulting shops. And so they don't get any value from really investing in digital technology. And so that's really difficult for us on the sponsor side to make use of what is essentially our own data.
I guess interesting, building on that, do you see sponsors challenging CROs for better access to data, more compatibility, or do you just see sponsors trying to bring more and more stuff in-house because they're like, hey, if they're not going to play with us nicely, we're going to do it ourselves?
Yeah, what I've seen is more and more trying to wrest control internally, and it comes in two forms. It's one, fully insourcing a capability. So instead of the CROs doing it, you don't trust them anymore, you bring that capability in-house. And there's potential challenges with that. It's often harder than you think to bring something internally, and it ends up being way more complicated and expensive long term. The other thing that's probably more common is imposing systems on the CRO. So you say, you use my EDC, you use my CTMS, you use my ETMF. And that honestly just drives more inefficiency on the CROs because they have to work with every unique sponsor's way of doing it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing, and again, I did a lot of consulting and dealt with a lot of companies going through that.
Lived it, yeah.
How do we work with our CROs? Because again, it's a multi-pronged, multi-team effort to bring drugs to market. How do we get access? To your point, it's not necessarily, hey, we want to do all the work, but we want to have insights into the work that's being performed. We want the data. We want to be able to understand what's transpiring during our study execution so that we could do future-looking things like maybe patient recruitment, site identification, things like that. And it's a challenge because I've seen a lot of CROs sort of view that as their special sauce right now. So I guess what do you see from a CRO perspective in particular that they can do better for us?
I mean, I would love for them to be able to use the data they have better, right? Another example in that was trying to predict trial enrollment. And the kind of state of the art that we were getting was an Excel spreadsheet with a straight line model of patient recruitment by week. Right? Not anything probabilistic, not anything, machine learning based. And so we wanted to do better, but Moderna had done only 50 studies at that time. And I say only because a typical biotech does 2, right? So we had 50 studies, but it's not significant enough to do something, whereas these CROs had done literally thousands of them. But they were just sitting on that data. They weren't using it in any kind of meaningful way. And so, we'd have conversations about how we get that, and they're like, we don't even know how to charge you for it, right? We don't even know how to make a data product out of this thing. So I think they've just got a long way to go in terms of embracing technology and embracing the use of data and AI.
No, definitely. I guess we talked a lot about data science, AI, things like that. You talked about some of your experience at Moderna. I guess, what excites you? What new things are you reading about, hearing about that get you really jazzed and pumped that, hey, there is a cool panacea or a future for us?
I don't know if there's a panacea, but I am truly excited about generative AI in this space. There's just a huge amount of text that is rampant in this industry, not just on the clinical side and the regulatory side, but on the quality side as well. We have a huge amount of documentation that we have to write. There's a huge amount of monitoring of regulatory guidelines and then updating those, and then every time there's a system change, you've got to do that. And I think it's really the potential for generative AI to really transform the way we deal with text in that space. It's just really exciting. I think could be a huge value unlock.
No, I agree. Excellent. I don't know if I have any other questions for you, Dave. I do want to open up to the audience if there's any questions for you. Obviously, Dave is going to be here all day, hopefully hanging out with us. Were there any questions from you all? Yeah.
I'm just curious, so you were at Moderna and had interactions with other leaders of the C-suite. Going forward, how do you set up an organization in terms of data science and interactions?
Yeah, it's interesting how. So the question is how Moderna was structured versus how other companies were structured with respect to data and AI. I think it's very interesting in this industry how in an early biotech company, you often have like a head of IT, and then that person reports into maybe your CFO. And again, it's reinforcing that model that IT and technology is a cost center, it's not a strategic value driver. So that's kind of the base level of what you see. And then you see more forward-thinking ones like, oh, let's hire a chief digital officer or something at the C-suite level. And I think that works to a point, right, where you're basically shoving anything to do with technology under that one person. And as long as you're a small enough company, that makes sense, right? All those tech people need a tech leader for that. When you get to a certain size, right, that becomes unbearable because in this decade and this age, right, technology is integral to everybody's process. And so the thought that you would aggregate that all under a single person in a company that you want to be tech forward seems a little bizarre. So I think there's a certain point you have to start federating these things out and having these tech capabilities distributed so that other senior leaders own that. Now, there's a particular structure of then what does the CIO have left? What do they do? What's the role of a chief data officer, a chief AI officer? I think it's to be seen, and it has to be whatever works for your organization. But I firmly believe in ownership, and I think if you have some sort of chief data officer who has no ability to act except through influence of other peers, I don't see how that can be successful. Sorry if that's you.
Any other questions? All right, well, excellent.
Well, great, thanks so much.
Dave, appreciate your time, sir.